we're now going to hear from a very different perspective. Please welcome to the stage the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I was as surprised to get this invitation as I was to be invited to Davos. But I'll go anywhere to talk about how the climate agenda is ending the American dream. So
ending the American dream. Okay, well, you get a sense. You've laid out, you've staked out your position. I want to just, before we dive into the conversation, just get a few of the specifics, because I think it's important to understand at sort of a granular level what Project 2025, which was produced by the Heritage Foundation, for which you wrote the foreword, proposes doing. And it's really quite a radical overhaul of how the federal government would approach things like climate change, the energy transition, and the regulation of pollutants. And just to name a few, I can't get to all of them because I think climate and environment appear on something like 150 pages of this 900-page document. But it would propose undoing many of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that Ali was just describing. It would drastically scale back climate research in the federal government. It would have the United States withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. It would weaken the Clean Air Act and promote additional fossil fuel drilling, including on public lands. It calls for the Environmental Protection Agency to be more deferential to industry science and to scale back research into toxic chemical exposure. It would reshape the Endangered Species Act. It would repeal the Antiquities Act to allow more drilling on federal lands. And again, the list goes on. And it's just important to note that these proposals, you're making them at a moment when we really are experiencing the effects of climate change. Scientists around the world are unanimous in their consent that extreme heat is killing record numbers of people, including 645 people in the Phoenix area alone last year. Insurance companies all across America are having a hard time writing policies because of increased risk of floods and fires. And the United States alone, we had $28 billion natural disasters, many of which scientists have concluded were made worse by man-made climate change just in the last year. So I'd like to start this conversation not by asking you what you want to undo, but to ask you, what is your proactive proposal to deal with climate change?
Well, to invert what the sort of philosophical overview that I think you represent accurately from your point of view, I disagree with a lot of the things you just said, but I'll answer your question. And that is, rather than take the well-funded agenda of elites in New York and Brussels and the Chinese Communist Party, why don't we ask the American people? And what the American people are telling us, thinking about, and no disrespect to the gentleman who was just here, certainly nothing personal, but the American people are telling us about the Inflation Reduction Act is that they can't name it, but they sure feel the effects of it. They feel the effects of energy inflation. There are something like 42,000 people in California right now who have had their electricity disconnected. A lot of factors that go into that, but one of those factors is that, and this is the key point, David, is that we have taken this idea of an energy transition. And I'm just, for the sake of having a friendly conversation, although we do have differences of opinion, going to posit, I'm going to ascribe altruistic motives to what you're trying to do. Even if that's the case, this has been so artificial, it has been so accelerated, that this energy transition is actually harming people far more than any of the harms that you would cite from so-called climate change. In fact, there are many good studies from completely objective sources, including my colleagues and scholars at Heritage, that show that there's actually been a reduction in climate-related deaths over the last century by 98%. That doesn't mean that we're rejecting that humans have an effect on climate. Clearly they do. That unanimity of scientists that you mentioned, be careful not to be too abusive with that, because you know better than anybody that there's a variety of perspectives on the extent of that. This is the final thing, to answer your question. We are, as political conservatives, also conservationists of the environment. What we're saying is, stop using the imposed will of the federal government, which probably is way too politicized, and imposing that on the American people. If, in fact, you build a popular consensus about this energy transition, public policy ought to reflect that. And by the way, the thrust of all of the work that we do in Project 2025, whether it's on this topic or others, is actually a corrective to the politicization of the federal government when it comes to these related policies. That's the kind of thing that we want to fix on behalf of the American people.
Just briefly, I want to jump in there. You talk about undoing the politicization, but in fact, Project 2025 proposes eliminating thousands of career
It's a
civil
corrective
scientists.
to several decades of politicizing the federal bureaucracy.
Okay, but
it's actually a constitutional corrective.
But Kevin, you're proposing replacing career civil servants and independent career scientists.
Well, we're proposing dramatically
appointees.
shrinking the size of federal government.
But you're proposing replacing scientists with political appointees. How does that undo the politicization of the government?
No, we're proposing that whether they're scientists or some other bureaucrat, and again, nothing against them as people and fellow Americans, that the politicized agenda that they have used to be a cudgel against the American people, a cudgel against ordinary Americans, comes to an end. We don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans. We actually want them to be objective. And I'll make a second point. I'm a lowly historian. I'm not a scientist. But the research method in history is very similar to the scientific method. Since when, in the scientific method, is it unacceptable for someone with the best of intentions to be a skeptic about the hypothesis? That's the kind of thing we're trying to bring back into government-funded scientific research.
And how do you see the role of government in actually producing scientific research? Because throughout Project 2025, you propose essentially rolling back or eliminating many of the ways in which the government supports independent research and gets it out to the American people.
It's highly politicized. The most important thing that
in what way? When you say it's highly politicized?
Let me answer your first question. I'll come back to that because it's really important, this point that you raise about what our belief is regarding government-funded scientific research. It's got one purpose. Most of this, or a lot of this, I am kind of a weather nerd, so I pay attention to those agencies that are in the Department of Commerce. It is to provide data for policymakers. And let's keep in mind, and maybe this is sort of a philosophical rub that we have friendly between us, the policymakers are in Congress. They're not in the administrative state. And they're in Congress in the ideas of our founders because it reflects the will of the American people. But you think about what we're trying to do with scientific research inside government, we're trying to streamline it. We're trying to make sure that everyone realizes that while it plays a role, we're conservatives, we believe that there is a role for government, that government doesn't have a monopoly on scientific knowledge. And if you think about the research grants that also flow from the Department of Education, which, as you know, we also want to eliminate yesterday, that doesn't mean that that comes to an end. It means that we have a far more efficient and much less politicized system of funding this research.
Okay, I really want to keep this conversation grounded in the proposed changes you want to make and what those effects might be on the American people. And I appreciate you've tried to inject that perspective as well. But let's do it on the pollution front. Project 2025 calls for rolling back reams of federal efforts to reduce harmful environmental pollution. It says the EPA Department of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance should be dismantled. It contemplates doing things like eliminating all scientific advisory boards that agencies like
very
the EPA
politicized bodies
rely on. It would weaken the Clean Air Act. Given all that, and you just said that you care about clean air and clean water, how did those changes actually result in more clean air and clean water? How are those things, rolling back pollution controls, good for Americans?
The result of these policies, if they're proposed, and obviously they're not up to us, they're up to policymakers, is actually the same thing that we have right now, which is that the United States has some of the cleanest air and water in the world. And what was interesting to me, and this is related about your previous conversation, and again, I offer this difference of opinion respectfully to you and to him, is that there is this thesis that if the United States leads on climate policy, the world will follow. That hasn't happened. In fact, if we eliminate all emissions and pollution in the United States, it has an almost non-measurable impact on pollution and emissions worldwide because we've been so good at it. These changes, in a nutshell, that we're proposing to government isn't to end clean air and clean water. It's, in fact, to get the politicized policymakers out of the way so that the free market, private citizens who, like you and me, are conservationists. I'm an active hunter and fisherman. I think we're the most active people, regardless of our politics and understanding we want a beautiful environment. And I'll just close this comment with this suggestion to you and to all of my new friends in this audience. Emphasizing that those of us who are skeptics about the climate agenda are somehow troglodytes and not with the program is not the way to go. You have the Biden-Harris administration, and I mean this in terms of policy because we don't get into partisan politics. They've made a grave mistake. They've made a grave mistake.
In what way?
They have taken the will of elites and they've imposed this on the American people. And right now, when the American people, I'll be quick, when the American people right now are paying their electric bills, when they're looking at inflation across the board, it's all related to these policies. I'll say this, in 2032, we're projecting that there will be a 30% electricity shortage in this country. Why is that? Because of the agenda that's represented by many in this room that is trying to accelerate this transition before people are ready, before the technology itself is ready. It's merely a corrective that we're trying to offer in this conversation.
Is there any common ground here?
Sure.
When you think about...
You like clean air and clean water?
Okay,
I like clean air and clean water.
How do you propose reducing emissions, reducing the pollution? What is your actual proactive plan?
Everything that we've been doing up to this point. Do you disagree that the United States has some of the cleanest air and water among the developed world? Do you? Can you prove that that's not the case? So why would we change that? We're on a great trajectory for
That's not the question I asked, though. Is there any common ground with some of the proposals that the White House is putting out, with the massive investments in clean energy that I've seen? I mean, I've been traveling around the country for the last... finished.
Okay.
Okay, right? There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of new jobs that are being created. I've been out. I've met men who were out of work because they were in the oil patch and they weren't getting the work that they expected, who are now helping build clean energy projects. And what do you say to them and to the Republican leaders in many of those districts who, as Mr. Zaidi just said, are asking Republican leadership to cool it with the attacks on the IRA because it is delivering real economic gains and it is delivering a manufacturing boom, which I've seen with my own eyes all across this country. So I ask you there, do you not see any potential for common ground where you could support the same kind of thing that is, maybe in your mind, could you acknowledge creating some economic growth and reducing emissions at the same time?
It's choosing. I'm very happy to find common ground. Let me start with that. But the second thing is I don't think we're going to find common ground on this. Whereas for the sake of evidence for your claim, you're going to hold out, I think the gentleman said 300,000 climate-related jobs that came as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. I would hold out, and my colleagues at Heritage would say, what about the tens of millions of Americans who are struggling to pay their electric bills? Nothing against the 300,000 who are well employed. I grew up in a working class, single mom household, and my mom was a secretary at an oil and gas company. I totally get it. I see public policy through the lens of working class people, and I know that you try to do as well. Maybe that's some common ground. My point is, and I'm going to use the word fixated, not to be a jerk, but I think it is correct in your case. You are fixated because of the blinders you have about the climate agenda, when our perspective at Heritage is on behalf of not just ordinary Americans, but the global poor who are damaged by these policies. My pleading to you is, if in fact we have common ground that it is great to have an all-of-the-above energy policy, how about we have government policy reflect that? How about this current administration reflect that, rather than choosing winners and losers? This is why, when the gentleman talks about the Inflation Reduction Act not being known by Americans, when they do know about it and they draw the connections to how it's affecting their pocketbooks, they grow to hate it.
Okay. I want to talk about Project 2025 and its relationship.
I've never heard of it.
Never heard of it. Well, neither has President Trump, evidently. 31 of the 38 authors were former Trump officials in Project 2025. I think I got that about right. You are close, or have been close, with both President Trump and Vice President candidate Vance. He wrote the foreword to your forthcoming book. You've traveled on private planes with President Trump to Heritage Foundation events. Can you explain to us, at a moment when the Trump administration is disavowing Project 2025, saying they've never heard of it, what is the relationship between Project 2025 and the Trump campaign?
It's easy. It's the same relationship that Heritage, which has been doing a presidential transition project since 1980, has had with any elected official who's willing to receive a policy briefing. We offered a policy briefing of Project 2025 to the entire field, including President Biden when he was an active candidate. And I don't think he took us up on that, but all sarcasm aside, I would have actually been very honored to go in there and give a policy briefing to him or his team. This is how Heritage operates. I know for people who are as much activists as they are journalists, they may not see that. But the relationship with President Trump and Senator Vance is the same that we have with any elected official who's willing to have a conversation with us about policy. Whether they're, just real quickly, it's real important, whether they're Democrats, whether they're Republican, whether they're politically unaffiliated like Mr. Kennedy, Ms. Gabbard, this is how we go about in doing our work.
And so why have they disavowed it so stridently?
Because they exist in a political lane, in a political season, and we exist in a policy lane and are waiting for the policymaking season. And so we allowed the radical left to define the brand Project 2025 because we're so focused on the policies and the personnel. We should have, figuratively speaking, punched back. Lesson learned. We're never going to stop doing presidential transition projects at Heritage. It's what we've done since Reagan. And even in that time, as some of my Heritage colleagues have written about in the last few weeks, President Carter was interested in having a conversation about some of those policies. You see, I'm not necessarily going to say this about you because you're always willing to have a conversation with me in spite of our disagreements, and I really do respect that and appreciate it. That's why I'm here. But there are a lot of people on the radical left who haven't read Project 2025. There are a lot of people on the radical left who hear Heritage Foundation and they think all of these terrible things. If, in fact, you want to develop common ground, then let's stop with the nonsense. I'm not pointing at you specifically. This is the kind of thing that if this country wants to get back to civil discourse and to have an intellectually honest conversation about policy, which doesn't require unanimity of opinion, but does require a zeal for the truth, we're going to sign up for that every day long because it's what we've been doing since 1973.
If you said you exist in a policy lane and they exist in a political lane and they're disavowing it, and we've heard from individuals inside that campaign that they say they're at war. They want nothing to do with Project 2025. Does that suggest that you essentially misread the moment? Did you do a disservice to the conservative movement by putting the wish list out there so visibly?
The project is the conservative movement. We've got 111 conservative organizations that are part of it. The key thing to keep in mind is that at Heritage, we're always focused on adding and multiplying across the center-right. We would love to have some folks who are left of center to be part of that. It is truly always nonpartisan. We're unabashedly conservative, but we couldn't care less.
But it was produced almost entirely by former Trump officials.
Well,
how is that nonpartisan?
Because the people who've served in Democrat administrations have a disagreement on the policy. There are also a lot of people who served in Bush administrations, and some people, both Bush administrations, and some people who served in the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Trump administration. So the fact that they're a part of the project is just how
Clinton or Obama in there, just to be clear?
Would have been happy to if they were right-minded about policy. But they weren't.
The Heritage Foundation has a long history of calling for lower taxes, yes?
That is correct. There's common ground. We just agreed on that.
In the Inflation Reduction Act, that's all carrots. That's all carrots. It's tax subsidies, it's tax breaks, it's tax incentives.
We do not like subsidies for anybody. We do not like picking winners and losers.
Subsidies for no one. Is that right?
That's correct.
But the Heritage Foundation has defended subsidies for oil and gas industry in the past. Why is that?
If we had a policy magic wand, we would completely change the tax code and all subsidies would go away.
Including for the oil and gas industry?
For everybody.
And then why is it, though, that you essentially have defended them? And I've read the policy papers.
We're not defending the industry or companies. We're defending good policy that recognizes a reality, which is that even for all of you who want to accelerate this energy transition, you have to have fossil fuels to do that. Just as we're sitting here, I could be really abusive in this conversation, know that time is waning, and talk about all of the ways all of us, including people who came here from out of town, live a high-carbon lifestyle.
Fully acknowledge it.
Okay. We're not there yet as a society to make that transition. Our research reflects that.
Do you feel like this administration has hampered the oil and gas industry in this country?
Well, they've done it on purpose.
But the oil and gas industry in the United States right now is experiencing record levels of production. Exploration continues. Profits are at all-time highs. How do you say, then, that this administration has hampered that industry?
Well, if you look at permitting, if you look at regulation, if you look at the fact that we've gone from being totally energy independent a few years ago to being very dependent on some of the worst actors in the world, and a very related issue, and I would hope that we would find at least a little bit of common ground on this. One of the problems with all of this is a factor that I would, as a Reagan conservative, say actually trumps all of the other motivations that you might have. And I want to ascribe the best motives to your agenda, and that is national security. All of this benefits the Chinese Communist Party. And I grew up at a time when liberals and conservatives and people in between would agree that the Soviet Union was the greatest existential threat to the United States at that time. I think the Chinese Communist Party is that for us today. And it ought to be good, maybe as we continue these conversations in the coming months and years, that we focus on that. Not for the sake of landing punches or, being wise Alex to one another, smart Alex to one another, but instead to actually look at the fact that we're benefiting the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party at the expense of ordinary Americans.
I'm glad you brought up China, because
I am too.
The truth of the matter is, I'm not rebutting, I'm not trying to debate you. That's not what I'm here for. But
really?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The issue with China right now on the climate front is that they are racing ahead with the production of renewables. They are leading in an enormous global industry. Their EV sales are wildly outpacing ours. All of this is allowing them to get a huge head start in what analysts around the globe anticipate to be a multi-trillion-dollar market. Are you not concerned that the U.S. is going to lose a step to China, given your concern about our competitiveness, by not investing in these same technologies that we see China going so far with?
No, I'm not concerned at all, and I don't mean that in a way to be petulant. In other words, I'm enjoying this conversation thread with you about China, because the broader context, as you no doubt know, is that China has half the coal plants in the world, and their pollution is astronomical. At the time when you and the White House climate advisors say that the world is following the United States, it just isn't. And China's imposition of people buying electric vehicles is the result of having a totalitarian regime. I think about something.
What's your evidence for that? I mean, that's a very specific statement. Are you?
Do I need to give you evidence the Chinese Communist Party is a totalitarian regime?
That is making people buy electric vehicles? That's the thread I want you to connect.
They're managing the economy, David. I don't think that this needs a lot of explanation. The point is, this is where the Biden-Harris regime wants us to go. And what happens? The American people said, I don't want an electric F-150. I know a car dealer in the American Southwest who literally wanted to give me an electric F-150. Ford required that every dealership have those, and they can't sell them. They literally can't give them away. I'm very happy, by the way, in my diesel F-150 because I enjoy my high-carbon lifestyle.
Sounds like Ford was trying to make people buy EVs.
Why were they doing that? Because the administration was creating false incentives and subsidies and regulations to make them do that. This is the folly of thinking that China's example is good.
Independent scientists around the globe, including the Copernicus Climate Change Service run by the European Union.
Oh, that sounds really objective.
Set that one aside. But a unanimity of scientists who follow global temperatures. And listen to the question, please. Those who follow and track independent data. You said you believe in science. Independent data has shown that the past year has been the hottest in recorded history. It's been, on average, 1.5 degrees Celsius than it was in pre-industrial times. Independent, again, you pick your source, but independent analysis has made it clear that that's exacerbating extreme heat, severe weather, drought around the world. And we are on track for at least 2 degrees, possibly much more of warming. As you think long-term about the fact that, as you said, China is still producing coal emissions, that's heating the planet. Is there any degree of warming that you think the United States or the world should stay below? Is there any level at which it becomes too dangerous? Or are you saying that there's no problem if the world gets to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius higher?
Well, two points. The first will be a little sharp, but I don't quite mean it as sharp as it sounds. That sounds like weather to me, not climate. A hot year. That's just true. The second is, I think the prescriptions are worse than the disease. Since the 1970s, we have seen headlines, covers of Time Magazine, Newsweek, all of these publications flip-flop between global cooling, global heating, no, this is getting straight to the heart of it. Because for 50 years, we've been hearing from science that we have 10 years to correct the trajectory. If we take all of the ideas, let's just take all the ideas of everyone in this room, and we implement them with a magic wand, our estimates show what would the difference in temperature be? 0.23 degrees Celsius. It's simply not going to make a difference. You're better off allowing free people and free market to make these decisions rather than impose this.
Well, that is out of line with the vast majority of independent scientists and scientific groups around the world. But please answer the question. Is there any degree of warming that you believe would be dangerous? Is there any degree of planetary heating? And it's not weather, because we're talking about, I just described, a 150-year trend that began before the Industrial Revolution and has shown consistent global heating, consistent global additional carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere on a steady line up and to the right. So the question is there any degree of planetary warming that you believe would be dangerous or that we should try to stay below?
And the answer is I reject the framing of your question because it violates the scientific method by looking at one variable in a much more complicated equation. I'm not saying that this isn't a consideration. What I'm saying is let's have an honest conversation about the trade-offs between being fixated on one data in a big scientific equation and all of the other factors, including human flourishing and prosperity, which benefit by having an all-of-the-above energy approach.
Okay, I'll have to close by simply noting we didn't get an answer to that question. Kevin Roberts, thank you very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you.